Hi everybody, how's it going? Welcome to another D&D optimized shorts, which basically I've been doing as a way to kind of get some additional content out there and sort of address what ends up, so far anyway, being kind of glorified, long-winded math problems. As opposed to going over a full deep dive build for a specific character, we kind of take a look at a very narrow sort of number problem in Dungeons and Dragons and try to kind of break down the math and talk about the numbers and answer a very specific, narrowly focused question. So today we're going to talk about the Double-Bladed Scimitar. The question being, can the Double-Bladed Scimitar compete damage-wise, sustained damage-wise, with a heavy weapon fighting, specifically Polearm Master, Great Weapon Master build, right? And there's two answers to that question. The short answer is no, not really. The longer answer is yes, in some very specific situations. Now, before we jump into a breakdown on the numbers, let me just say something that I probably shouldn't need to say, and that is, if you want to play a character that uses a double-bladed scimitar because you think it's really cool or fun or it's important to your character's story or whatever, then you absolutely should. Full stop, right? You will be able to make it work. You'll be viable, and you will have fun. So, no regrets. If it's important to your character, you should absolutely do it. And there are ways to make it sort of pretty good and maybe as strong as possible. And we'll kind of get into some of that today. So I've had a lot of requests from several of you to do a build based on the Double-Bladed Scimitar. For those who don't know, Double-Bladed Scimitar is a very unique and cool weapon. It talks about it in the official D&D content. It's kind of an Elven thing, but it's essentially a double-bladed sword. It's think of it as like a staff with a scimitar blade on each end, right? And so stylistically, it's really cool. I love the concept of it. And at the end of the day, I haven't yet, and maybe I will one day, but I haven't yet put together a build focused on using the double-bladed scimitar, primarily because no matter how I crunch the numbers, I've just had a hard time having it make sense from a purely like sustained damage optimized perspective, right? When comparing it to either someone using a great weapon, particularly a polearm with the Polearm Master Feat and the Great Weapon Master Feat, doesn't generally compare damage-wise, or also doesn't compare super favorably to a two-weapon fighter with one of those weapons being a shadow blade, like we discussed in my last short a couple of weeks ago. The double-bladed scimitar is really cool. It has some neat perks, right? It does let you essentially use a two-handed weapon to make an attack on your bonus action, right? So what happens when you're using the double-bladed scimitar is the first attack is made with it's a 2d4 of damage, and then you get a bonus action attack with the other end. It's only a 1d4, but it does let you sort of innately weaponize your bonus action, right? So as a bonus action, you can make an additional attack with the other end of the double-bladed scimitar for 1d4 of damage. So in a way, it's just like the Polearm Master Feat in that you get to make a bonus action offhand, essentially attack, and be able to take advantage of your ability score increase, right? Since you're using the same weapon, you would still get your bonus damage from your ability score, whether it be strength or dexterity, we'll get into that in a minute, without having to take the 2-weapon fighting style. And it's nice because you don't have to take a feat to get it either. You don't have to take the Polearm Master feat. So you sort of, right from the get-go, sort of get the benefits, kind of, or some of the benefits of kind of that Polearm Master free bonus action attack, and 2-weapon fighting. You get to add your ability score increase to your bonus action attack. So at first glance, it seems like that's pretty good. You almost get the benefits of a feat and a fighting style essentially for free just by using that weapon, right? Unfortunately, unlike most Polearm Master builds, the Double-Bladed Scimitar cannot benefit rules as written from the Great Weapon Master feat. So the Great Weapon Master feat, of course, is the one that lets you, if you're using a heavy weapon, add a +10 in damage to every hit that lands at the cost of -5 to hit, right? The reason being that the Double-Bladed Scimitar, and a lot of people don't realize this, I think, is not a heavy weapon. It is a two-handed weapon, and it has the two-handed property, but it does not have the heavy property. And the Great Weapon Master feat requires you to be using a heavy weapon in order to benefit from that +10 to damage. And so it has a hard time competing with a heavy weapon master user for that reason, because you can't take advantage of the Great Weapon Master feat. So to me, when I first consider the Double-Bladed Scimitar, it feels a little bit just like a kind of a slightly worse 2-weapon fighting style build, a 2-weapon build. And as we discussed in my last short, 2-weapon fighting doesn't really compete with the Polearm Master, Great Weapon Master user for damage, for sustained damage, unless we're a martial class using Shadow Blade for one of those weapons, again, like we discussed. And even then, that only competes at a higher enemy armor class, and especially in Dim Light. Now, why do I say it feels worse? Let's look at the math. Just for the weapon attacks, right? Comparing the Double-Bladed Scimitar to 2-weapon fighting style. With the Double-Bladed Scimitar, as I've mentioned, your first attack is a 2d4, or 5 on average, on the first hit. The second bonus action attack is a 1d4, or 2.5, so that's a total of 7.5, right? Compared to someone dual wielding with 2 weapons, keeping in mind that without a feat, they are just using d6 weapons, right? They have to be light, so short swords, etc. So they are doing 3.5 for the one hand and 3.5 for the other hand, for a total of 7. However, if they simply take the dual wielder feat, they get to use d8 weapons, like a longsword, for example, or a rapier. So now you're doing a d8 and a d8, or 4.5 and 4.5, for a total of 9, right? So 9 compared to 7.5, obviously you give the advantage to the dual wielder. Now, hold on a minute, you may say. If the 2-weapon fighter gets a feat, well then the Double-Bladed Scimitar user should get a feat as well. Great, fine. In that case, as a Double-Bladed Scimitar user, we would obviously take the Revenant Blade feat, if we are comparing apples to apples, right? Which was made specifically for a Double-Bladed Scimitar user. The Revenant Blade feat is cool, and it gives us some nice benefits. It gives you a +1 to your strength or dexterity. It allows you to use the Double-Bladed Scimitar as a finesse weapon, which is nice, and which we will be doing. Hold your horses there. And it gives you a +1 to your armor class. So does the dual wielder feat. So that's kind of a wash. But when you look at those things, none of them necessarily are going to give you a bump to your damage, right? I know, depending on what your strength or dexterity is when you take the feat, it may potentially cause your bonus to hit and bonus to damage to increase, but not necessarily. So again, you still have the advantage going to the 2-weapon fighter user, right? Now, there are some other things to consider, of course. First of all, keep in mind that in order to really benefit from 2-weapon fighting, the person using 2 weapons would need to get the 2-weapon fighting style, because that allows you to add your bonus from your ability score to your offhand attack, right? Which the Double-Bladed Scimitar user gets innately. So they have to take that fighting style, and they've got to take either a level in fighter, a level in ranger, or at least pick up the fighting initiate feat, right? So that they can get that fighting style in order to really benefit. And so again, you may say, well, if the 2-weapon fighter gets a fighting style or has to take a fighting style, well then, what about the Double-Bladed Scimitar user? And here is something really cool that not a lot of people, I think, pick up on innately. And that is that the Double-Bladed Scimitar does qualify for the Great Weapon Fighting style, right? It does not qualify for the Great Weapon Master feat, but the Great Weapon Fighting style just requires that you be using a 2-handed weapon, which the Double-Bladed Scimitar is. And so, even though 2d4 and 1d4 is less than 1d8 and 1d8, if you get the Great Weapon Fighting style with the 2d4, 1d4, and you get to therefore re-roll your 1s and your 2s, then it does take a slight numerical advantage. It's about 1 DPR, damage per round, depending on your level, depending on the enemy armor class, etc. Okay, great. So at least statistically, the Double-Bladed Scimitar user has an advantage over the 2-weapon fighter user innately. Fantastic, but again, as we discussed in the last short, that's not really saying much, right? When compared to the Polearm Master, Great Weapon Master users of the world. Even forgetting for a moment the benefit that those Polearm Master users get from the Great Weapon Master feat, and just comparing, the Double-Bladed Scimitar user with the Revenant Blade feat and a Polearm user with the Polearm Master feat, the Polearm Master user gets a 1d10 for their first attack and a 1d4 for their bonus action attack, right? Compared to, and so that's a 5.5 plus 2.5 for a total of 8 on average, compared to the the Double-Bladed Scimitar, who's, a total of 7.5 on average. So very slight advantage to the Polearm Master user statistically. And then, of course, when you add the Great Weapon Master feat, the advantage to the Polearm Master just goes through the roof. Of course, you would rightly say, okay, but if they get the Great Weapon Master feat, then we should get a second feat as a Double-Bladed Scimitar user as well. And what would we do then? Okay, absolutely valid point. So if we're a Double-Bladed Scimitar user picking up our second feat in order to compare with that Great Weapon Master user, we'd probably want to just take an ability score increase, right? And you'd want to bump it at least by 1, because we got 1 already from the Revenant Blade feat. So we need 1 more in order to guarantee that our bonus increases, right? Our bonus to hit and bonus to damage. And for my money, the best use of that in order to get that +1 would be to take the Elven Accuracy feat. Now, let's be clear on some things. First off, Elven Accuracy only benefits you if your attacks are made with dexterity or charisma or wisdom or intelligence, not strength, right? Thankfully, the Revenant Blade feat let us use finesse, let the Double-Bladed Scimitar be a finesse weapon, right? And so we can, if we take both of these feats, get a +2 to our dexterity use the Double-Bladed Scimitar with our dexterity as a plus to hit and plus to damage, and benefit from Elven accuracy. Just as a side note, in my personal opinion, if you have a choice between using dexterity for your plus to attack and plus to hit, plus to damage, or strength, you're generally going to be better off going dexterity unless strength is important to your character for whatever reason. But, dex will bump your armor class depending on what armor you're wearing. It will bump your initiative. And generally, dexterity saving throws are more valuable than strength saving throws in D&D, depending on what monsters you're fighting and things. And so, so taking dex here gives you other nice advantages, and so we might as well while we're at it. And of course, again, you can only benefit from Elven accuracy if you're using dexterity, or at least you can't benefit for strength attacks, right? So, okay, we're going Elven accuracy. So between that and Revenant Blade, we are getting a +2 to our attack score over the Polearm Master Great Weapon Master feat, right? So we have a +1 to hit and a +1 to damage when compared to the Polearm Master user, all other things being equal. Great. That in and of itself, however, is not enough to make up for the superior damage that the Polearm Master user gets. The +10 to damage on every hit is just better most of the time than a +1 to hit and a +1 to damage, right? So let's get into that. Of course, as we all know, the Great Weapon Master user only gets that +10 to damage at the cost of a -5 to hit. So eventually, as the enemy armor class gets higher, the Great Weapon Master user has to turn off the Great Weapon Master feat, right? So that they're landing attacks and not just whiffing all the time. At that point, when they have to turn off, when the Great Weapon Master user has to turn off their Great Weapon Master feat, then yes, the Double-Bladed Scimitar user does slightly better damage on average thanks to their +1 to hit and +1 to damage. They take the lead even a little bit sooner thanks to Elven accuracy if they have advantage on all of their attacks, right? Because again, with Elven accuracy, anytime you have advantage, instead of rolling 2d20s, you get to roll 3d20s, and that's just going to greatly increase your likelihood of landing a hit and a crit. So one other thing to remember is that Great Weapon Master users generally, with one exception, and we'll get into it, can't benefit from Elven accuracy because they are using strength to make their attacks, right? So we have that kind of leg up on them when you're in a situation where you're getting all of your attacks with advantage. Let's look at a quick example just to sort of illustrate all of these numbers, right? We're gonna assume a level 5 character that took either custom lineage or variant human, so you got a free feat at level 1, and then another your second feat that you wanted at level 4. By level 5, you have your extra attack, and we're gonna assume that you have the Great Weapon fighting style that both of you want, both the Great Weapon Master user and the Double-Bladed Scimitar user. So that means you're a paladin, a fighter, a barbarian, or a ranger, right? So you've got kind of everything that you want early on for your martial attacks. The Polearm Master user only has a +3 to hit and to damage at this level, and the Double-Bladed Scimitar user has a +4, right? Now, assuming that both characters have advantage on all of their attacks, the Polearm Master, Great Weapon Master user does 48 damage per round to an enemy with 10 armor class, and 16 damage per round to an enemy with a 20 armor class. And this is not accounting for any additional sort of class features, rage or Giant's Might if you went Rune Knight Fighter or something like that. It's not taking any of this into account. Spells that you may be casting, etc. It's just looking at kind of pure weapon damage, right? The Double-Bladed Scimitar user, by comparison, against a 10 AC, an enemy with a 10 armor class, does 29 damage, but against an enemy with 20 armor class does 23. So that's quite a bit better than that Great Weapon Master user. They surpass the Great Weapon Master user at about a 17 enemy armor class. Now, how many enemies are you fighting at level 5 with a 17 armor class? Not a ton. They're out there. And against those low enemy armor classes, the Great Weapon Master user is doing like 60% more damage. But hey, at least there's something to talk about here, and it's not just Great Weapon Master is always better all of the time, right? Of course, the question then becomes, how do you guarantee yourself advantage on all of your attacks? There are a few ways that we can do that, right? The easiest is probably be a barbarian and use reckless attacks. The problem there, of course, for the Double-Bladed Scimitar user is that you don't benefit from rage unless you're making strength-based weapon attacks. And if we want to use Elven accuracy, as we've already discussed, you can't do that. And so if you're a barbarian using a Double-Bladed Scimitar, you either can't benefit from Elven accuracy or you can't benefit from rage, and that feels bad. Another option would be to cast Greater Invisibility on yourself. That's a 4th level spell, so you wouldn't get it until at least level 7, depending on your class, and fighters wouldn't get that. Even an Eldritch Knight doesn't get a 4th level spell until level 19. Paladins wouldn't until level 13. Rangers wouldn't until level 13. Barbarians can't cast spells nor concentrate on them while raging, right? So you can see that really limits your options. Option 3, of course, would be to do what we have done so often on this show, which is to go Devil's Sight and Darkness, as a Hexblade, basically. Of course, the problem with that is that if you're rolling Hexblade, that means you get to use Charisma for your attacks to hit and to damage, right? And Charisma-based users can benefit from Elven accuracy. And if you can benefit from Elven accuracy by using Charisma as your attack, there's no reason, statistically speaking, why you shouldn't be taking Polearm Master and Great Weapon Master as opposed to the Double-Bladed Scimitar. Unless we're talking about really high enemy armor classes, right? And so you'd be a little bit silly, in my opinion, just looking at the numbers, purely from a numbers and statistics perspective, to not go Polearm Master, Great Weapon Master in that scenario. There are, of course, other ways to get advantage. A familiar will give it to you, but only on one attack, right? You could get the new fighting style, new to Tasha's, blind fighting, and cast something like Fog Cloud and on your enemies, and then wade into the fog and give yourself advantage. Blind fighting won't be available to us until we can get yet another feat, which for most classes will come at level 8. For fighters, it would come at level 6. So, there's an option there, probably as an Eldritch Knight, right? So the long answer to the question, can a Double-Bladed Scimitar build compete with a Polearm Master, Great Weapon Master build for sustained DPR, damage per round, is yes, if you have a way to get advantage on every attack, have at least 2 feats at higher enemy armor classes, and if you're not playing a Hexblade or a Barbarian. It leaves us with precious few options, right? A Valor or a Swords Bard, who took a level 1 fighter dip to get the Great Weapon fighting style. They cast Greater Invisibility on themselves by the time they're level 7. Bard, of course, they had to take a fighter dip, so level 8. That's a potential option there. As I just mentioned, an Eldritch Knight maybe, who by level 6 would have all of the feats that they needed and the ability to cast Fog Cloud. This could be a spoiler alert for my Eldritch Knight build, because I'm getting a lot of requests to do an Eldritch Knight build, so you guys might be getting a taste for that. Stay tuned. Blade Dancers wouldn't get the benefit from Blade Song if they were using a two-handed weapon, so need not apply. Again, options are limited, but at least there's some interesting conversation to be had around it. So yes, in conclusion, it is possible for the Double-Bladed Scimitar user to be competitive, statistically speaking, with other weapon fighting styles. It's just that you have to be very careful if you really want to be competitive from a numbers perspective. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's not all about the numbers, right? And ultimately, if you want to build a character using the Double-Bladed Scimitar because it's cool and or fun and or important to your character and your role play, etc., go for it. But just be careful if you want to eke the most damage possible out of that build. Know what you're getting into. Know which feats and fighting styles and classes that you're going to need in order to kind of maximize the damage for the Double-Bladed Scimitar. So that's my short for the day, for the week, and that's the end of the show. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like, and continue the conversation on our Reddit channel, Reddit subreddit. Happy New Year. Love you guys. You're fantastic, and we will see you soon.